We're going to talk about Bethany Christian Services now. And this is my second part in my probably going to be 3, maybe 4 article series about this organization. You can find this article at thelastamericanvagabond.com. LastAmericanVagabond.com. You can go over to the T-Lab team. You see my name, Derrick Broze, and you can find all my articles there, including this latest one, Bethany Christian Services, Mothers Speak Out. And as I said earlier, guys, in the process of this article, this specific article, I spoke to 3 mothers on the record, and then I've spoke to another who has shared, was originally the mother and the family sharing this information with me that are not yet able or ready to come out publicly. And this is not a story about Jeffrey Epstein. This is not a story about Israel. It's not headline news, but this is just as important as any of the other things you're going to hear about this week. And so I hope for the next 20 minutes or so here, you will give this your full attention. And when I put out a clip of this talk later, you will share it around. You will go to the LastAmericanVagabond.com, read the article and read it. Because just like with the Israeli situation, just like I said, we need to be a voice for people who are suffering. I try with my work, whether it's the Epstein, the Finders, the Utah ritual abuse, a lot of these trafficking stories I've covered over the years. It's not about just trying to, what's the most salacious detail? And is there a celebrity involved? Is there somebody famous involved? I see people getting sucked into that. When we often forget that there are real people involved, there are victims. And in this case, there are mothers, there are families, and there are children, in many cases now grown adult children who have dealt with some pretty messed up things and are still dealing with it. They're still trying to process that. So at the end of the day, this is not about trying to, give you some salacious details of horrible things, because some of these things are not that great. Some of the people's stories and the ways that they were treated and lied to, and then unfortunately, some of the children through the adoption industry being sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally abused, psychologically abused. It's not fun stuff necessarily to read about. It's not necessarily fun stuff for me to dive deep into and to report on, but it matters. And these people, these women, these mothers deserve a voice. So that's why I wrote this article. It's about 3,000 words long. So it might be a little long for some of you, but I hope you will take the time throughout this week to read it. And the second part of our investigation into Bethany Christian Services, we speak to several mothers who were directly impacted by what they say were deliberate efforts by BCS to coerce, manipulate, and outright lie to them regarding the conditions of relinquishing their parental rights. Mothers who say they were lied to by the nonprofit adoption firm Bethany Christian Services are speaking out and warning anyone who will listen to be wary of promises made by BCS and other adoption agencies. As I mentioned before, this is an adoption firm, a foster firm, and they do pregnancy counseling. They describe their mission as, quote, an effort to demonstrate the love and compassion of Jesus Christ by protecting children, empowering youth, and strengthening families through quality social services. However, as I said, many women who've interacted with them have spoken out now about their traumatic experiences. And as I mentioned, we spoke with 4 women about their experiences. And while their stories differ in the specific details about how they came to know Bethany Christian Services, their outcomes are almost nearly identical. Every woman we spoke with told us that Bethany Christian Services promised that if they chose to relinquish their parental rights and allowed their child to be adopted, they would be able to participate in a so-called open adoption, where they would receive pictures of their children, letters updating them on their lives. And every one of these women said that the promises were not upheld and often were just completely ignored. And every one of these women also knows other women and other families who have been negatively impacted by Bethany Christian Services. And they are all part of what I've recently learned about, this growing online community of social media pages, websites, forums, dedicated to raising awareness about the problems that they've experienced, not only with Bethany Christian Services, but with the adoption industry in general. So that's sort of the background for what we're diving into. And now what I'm going to share with you guys after this is their specific stories. And again, I want to encourage you to read this. I don't want to sit there and read the entire article for you. It's quite long, but I do want to give you a taste of what some of these women have gone through. Now, the first thing I'll say is in part 1 of this article, we looked at who the history of Bethany Christian Services. They've been around for 80 years now, how they've gotten support from the DeVos family, who is most famous for Betsy DeVos, who is Donald Trump's Secretary of Education. The DeVos family is one of these evangelical Christian families that donate to evangelical Christian philanthropic organizations, including Bethany Christian Services. We also looked at how Bethany Christian Services has been involved in U.S. government separating of children under the Trump and the Biden administrations. And then we also looked at the history of lawsuits against Bethany Christian Services and parents who have accused them of manipulating or lying to them in order to secure adoption. So we covered all that in part one, but that was more broad. That was sort of on the public record, me finding out things that, that were sent to me and shared with me. But now this, we talk with three women. The first woman, her name is Mickey. And we also talked to Charity J, and then we talked to Jennifer. So I'm going to share a little bit about these three women's stories. And again, you can find this article at thelastamericanvagabond.com. If you know anybody with Bethany Christian Services or who has experienced something with them, you can reach out to me at derrick@theconsciousresistance.com or intothe light@protonmail.com. Derrick@theconsciousresistance.com, into the light at protonmail.com. Because these women have also expressed to me that if any mothers who have gone through this are looking for people to talk to, they want to make themselves available to connect with you, to hear your story, and to help you know that you're not alone in dealing with this. So Mickey told me that she had a traumatic childhood involving physical and emotional abuse. She would end up being emancipated at the age of 16, and her birth mother died only 2 years later when she was 18 years old. And in 1990, she started dating an Indian man from her neighborhood. She was 21 years old at the time, and she said she shortly after that found out she was pregnant. And when she found out she was pregnant, he pressured her to have an abortion. And she would later find out that this man had 6 or 7 children and a wife back in India. And she went into hiding to avoid his pressure, because he was, again, trying to pressure her to have an abortion. She was trying to hide from him. He apparently returned to India and eventually comes back. He starts stalking her, continues to put pressure on her about this abortion. She's got no family support. As I mentioned, her mother died. She was emancipated at 16 years old, and she wasn't getting any from her ex-boyfriend. So she sought help from a counselor. And this is usually how this thing happens. I talked about this in the first article, that Bethany Christian Services appears to have contracts and deals with hospitals and with different types of organizations, social services. So in this case, Mickey, she's like in this situation, she's 21 years old, doesn't have a lot of financial, support of her own, doesn't have a lot of family support. The ex-boyfriend's pressuring her to get an abortion. She needs some help. So she goes to a counselor, and the counselor connects her to Bethany Christian Services in Chino, California. Mickey then meets the director of Bethany Christian Services in Chino, and she starts showing her families of pictures of families who might be willing to adopt her child once she has them. And Mickey specifically requested a biracial couple that might mirror her son's father's Indian complexion. The couple then introduced the couple that BCA's introduced to Mickey did not satisfy her request and said she was not comfortable with them, because basically what she told me was like they were like a white couple. And again, she has an half Indian son. She's like, it's going to be obvious that the baby, these are adopted parents, that might create some kind of problem. Maybe the baby can have some parents that look like him. And when she spoke up about this and she expressed this to the Bethany Christian Services director, she was ignored. And she says at one point she was told that Child Protective Services would be called on her if she didn't have a proper home set up for her children. So let's kind of take stock of this. This is a pregnant mother, 21 years old, with no support. At this point, she has not signed over her rights or anything because the baby hasn't been born, right? You can't sign over parental rights. The baby's not born yet. But they're already putting pressure on her to go towards these certain families. And they're starting to say things like, well, look, if you don't do the adoption and you end up having your baby, we know your situation. You don't have a lot of money. You don't have a lot of resources. It's like, it would be a shame if somebody called CPS on you and, told them the situation you're living in. It's like these veiled and thinly veiled threats. And so that's what she was told, like, hey, CPS might get called on you and used against you if you don't have a proper home. So kind of putting that fear in her mind already. She said that the couple who was aggressively pursuing this adoption just would not back up, and that Bethany Christian Services was not offering any support for her. And again, at this point, she hasn't signed away any parental rights. It's just discussion on, hey, this family might want to have your baby. And they start getting super aggressive about it. And when she told Bethany Christian Services she was not ready to sign adoption papers, she says she was pressured into putting her child into foster care. This is, of course, after he was born. She says she put him in foster care and she continued to looking for solutions to keep her child. So at this point, she doesn't have the resources to take care of him, but she's not signing away her parental rights. So she puts him in some foster care. And then after a month of that, she signs adoption papers, and she believed that the adoption would be basically the best chance for her child to have a better life. But she still said that she felt pressured. She felt like she didn't have any support at the time. And after the birth and the adoption, Mickey sunk really deeply into what she told me was just a period of postpartum depression and heavy drinking. She said, quote, "I couldn't deal with losing my kid. I heard nothing from Bethany from that point on." She also says she wasn't provided any of the counseling that they had promised her prior to the adoption. And then this is the interesting part. She says her son's father eventually comes back into the picture. And when the child was only 3 months old and he wanted to reclaim his parental rights, he basically said, like, okay, so you didn't get the abortion, but you adopted the baby. Like, I would have wished you would have not adopted him. She said it was a cultural thing, that he was very much against it. And when she told this to the Bethany Christian Services director, the father of the child said, "You're going to need to get an attorney if you want your child back." But the father didn't have money. Mickey didn't have the money to fight a potentially costly and lengthy legal battle, and so they were unable to reclaim the child. The father was unable to reclaim his parental rights. And Mickey also says that Bethany Christian Services failed to locate him prior to the adoption to see if the child had any other family that could care for him. And she basically said she was told to act as if her baby daddy, basically, that the father didn't exist, because this is what you have to understand, is if the child has another family member out there, then they're not supposed to adopt. They're not supposed to just give him out to some people. They're supposed to say, okay, well, look, the mom can't take care of him, but look, there is a family member available. The father's available. He has resources, etc. And maybe they wouldn't have even accepted him, but still, the point is they didn't even try. She says, quote, "Mickey told me this: they prey on people who don't have support, people who have dysfunctional families. They prey on women who are in very weak positions. I was completely lied to. My whole adoption was fraudulent." She says that she was told that the adoptive parents would pay for any counseling that she needed after the adoption. And of course, that didn't happen. She believed that it was going to be an open adoption, but she never had access to her child. Again, she says, quote, "I was never invited to see my child. If I wanted to write, I had to go through Bethany. Every night when I would go to sleep, I didn't know anything, what city he was in, who these people were. It was really bizarre." And she says, in the years since the adoption, she communicated with her child, and she learned of several incidents of physical and emotional abuse from the adoptive father, including a fractured arm. So that's what she told me, that we're not naming anybody, but obviously the child's father, adoptive father, she showed me text messages and information that seemed to confirm what she told me, that there was physical and emotional abuse to her child. She says her child has struggled with forming relationships and continues to deal with the trauma of the adoption and separation. Mickey also says that the adoptive parents also pulls her child out of school, often disrupting education. Now, this is where things take a little bit more of a turn, where up until this point, Mickey is, which I'll say here, Mickey is a pseudonym. Mickey is the name that this mother is using to speak to me on the record, but not with her real name. But Mickey's case is interesting because there's actually an investigation that took place related to hers, as well as another case involving Bethany Christian Services. In 2019, Mickey's case would end up becoming the subject of a complaint investigation against Bethany Christian Services. A copy of the report states that on December 24, 2019, the Community Care Licensing Regional Office in California's Department of Social Services received a complaint accusing Bethany of, quote, failing to follow adoption agency procedures. Now, this isn't a lawsuit. This is just a complaint, a citation. It's kind of, unfortunately, even though it's on the record, it's almost toothless. Like, it doesn't, Bethany, nobody went to jail. Nobody was fined as far as I could see. But this investigation involved confidential interviews with 4 members of Bethany Christian Services staff and a review of 2 adoptive family files and 2 what they call relinquishing parent files. And one of these files relates to Mickey's situation. The complaint says the investigation revealed that reference number 8, who was 17 years old at the time, and redacted, were relinquished in 1991, was being treated by a psychologist and had been prescribed medication due to mental health issues because of the murder of number 8's mother. Number 8 is Mickey, of course. And Mickey, as I mentioned, her mother had been killed when she was a young age. So they're confirming that the investigation shows that she was being treated by a psychologist and had been prescribed medication. For those who are looking on my screen, it looks all weird right there because I'm on a privacy browser. But if you look at it on your non-privacy browser, you'll be able to see the actual documents there. You can see they're embedded right there. The citation also states that number 8 disclosed this information to Bethany Christian Services, but there was, quote, no record that Bethany Christian Services referred number 8 to a licensed physician or a clinical psychologist for an evaluation to determine their ability to understand the content, nature, and effect of signing the relinquishment. So basically, under these adoption rules, they're supposed to check the mother, the parent, and they found that, hey, she was being treated. She had, issues from her mom's murder, and she might not have been able to fully understand what she was doing at the time. But Bethany Christian Services, even though they made a note that she was being treated by somebody, by a therapist, they tried to wiggle out of it and basically said that because it was a therapist, that doesn't meet the same, it's not the same thing as a psychologist. Basically, Bethany, in this case, they made the adoption, they bent the rules, even though they knew that according to the law and the adoption procedures, this adoption shouldn't have taken place. And it was concluded that a preponderance of evidence had been met and that the complaint against Bethany was substantiated. The, quote, plan for correction ordered this agency to include requiring the relinquishing parent to receive 3 references for mental health providers. Then Bethany would speak to this mental health provider. So not really anything big, but again, it's on the record that they did something wrong. Mickey told us, quote, I was on Social Security disability. They were supposed to contact my psychiatrist. They never did. They bypassed everything that they were supposed to do. And Bethany was notified about this investigation in November 2020, and they would appeal the decision 2 times in January and March 2021. They attempted to argue, as I said, that they weren't required to report Mickey's therapy or counseling because it did not qualify as psychiatric treatment. But guess what? Both of Bethany's attempts to wiggle out of this, they were denied. Both appeals were denied. And Mickey said, quote, they determined because of what I was diagnosed with that I didn't have the mental capacity at the time to consent to knowing what this meant for the rest of my life. She believes that Bethany took advantage of her vulnerability and her fragile emotional state after she suddenly lost her parents only 4 years prior to the pregnancy. She told me, quote, the grief that I've had to live with has definitely affected me in every way. I do blame them 100% for this. I think if I had never crossed paths with Bethany, I would have never experienced the physical and mental problems that I am facing now. It just never goes away. So that is the story of Mickey. We're talking, for those who are just joining us, we are speaking about the Bethany Christian Services organization. I encourage you guys to learn more about this. If you're not familiar with it, this is, I'm continuing to follow the story and I'll stay on it as much as I can. There's going to be more pieces. We're going to start looking at the international scene, and we're also going to try to end with some solutions and show you some, as I mentioned, there's like this not underground, but it's a growing internet community, social network community of people who have had their children adopted through Bethany Christian Services, or have had a negative interaction with them, and they're using TikTok, Instagram, etc., to find each other, to then raise awareness about these problems. And hopefully the idea would be that to prevent other mothers from following down the same path. I mean, that's really the only thing you can do, right? Is if we can get this word out, get this information out, and enough parents hear it, then maybe there's some parent that considers going to Bethany Christian Services, or they're considering adoption, that they might actually think about the consequences. Because I'm not trying to say that every adoption that has ever taken place through Bethany Christian Services, or every adoption that has ever taken place in the history of man, has turned out this way. Clearly, that's not the case. Obviously, that's not reality. But some of them do take place that way. Some of them do happen that way, and we need to find a way to move past that. And the way that we do that, at least from my perspective, is to educate people, to tell people that this is happening. If people don't know what's happening, how can they stop it? If people don't know that this is going on, how can they ask bigger questions, right? Because if I was a parent, and if I was somebody who couldn't have children and was pursuing an adoption as an alternative, I would definitely go to a place like Bethany. I would ask, if I dealt with them, for one, I would show them my reports and say, hey, look, have you seen this? These mothers are saying you did this thing and this thing and that thing to them. Can you explain to me? Can you answer for these accusations? And see what they say. And hopefully you would go somewhere better. But also, again, I think that what I'm learning from talking to these mothers is that the reality is that not all adoptions are what we are told. They're not all just there's a gay couple that wants to adopt because they can't have children, or there's a family that's been trying for 10 years and they just can't have children, so they adopt. Yes, those are the best case scenarios, but that's definitely not every scenario. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the times when things go wrong. So let's go ahead and get back to this Bethany Christian Services article. We're going to hear now about Charity J. Again, I'm not going to read these entire articles, but I do encourage you to go to thelastamericanvagabond.com. I want to give each of them a little bit of time so you can hear about their lives. Charity grew up in a home influenced by the Institute of Basic Life Principles. Have you ever heard of that? A controversial conservative denomination who has been referred to as a cult by some and the subject of a 2023 Amazon documentary titled Shiny Happy People. She was taught that her main goal in life should be to, quote, get married and have lots of children. She suffered emotional and psychological abuse during her childhood, and she chose to leave her family at age 19 for the Job Corps. And in 1997, she met a 27-year-old man who was religious as well, and she believed that he had shared values and goals, and they struck up a relationship, and they married soon after. But Charity says 6 months into the relationship, he became emotionally abusive, and that he became physically abusive once he learned that she was pregnant. Charity planned an escape and left with her son 1 month after he was born. So she runs away, leaves at 19 after living in what some have described as a cult, meets another religious man. They got together really quick because, you can't have sex if you're not married. So you get married, then emotional abuse starts, physical abuse starts once he learns she's pregnant, and then she leaves as soon as she can. She was briefly homeless before getting enough support to get a job and a place to live. Despite having a restraining order and stalking order in place against her ex, he violated both orders by showing up at her workplaces and getting her fired. He would eventually break into her apartment before being arrested and charged with attempted murder and child endangerment. Following the arrest, Charity was living in a shelter with her son. After a few days, the CPS arrived with the police officers and took her son into their custody. She said it was terrifying, quote, now I know what my son went through with trauma being separated from me. And after 6 months, so her son, basically, as she's in the homeless shelter, they come, CPS somehow, so someone calls them and they take her son away, and he goes into this organization that I probably will investigate in the future called D.A. Blodgett. And her son stayed with D.A. Blodgett. But D.A. Blodgett is also connected to Bethany Christian Services. And basically, Charity started to visit her son at D.A. Blodgett, and she noticed that he was regressing. He wasn't hitting the usual milestones for infants that they do checks for, keeping eye contact and just showing signs of developing. And she was encouraged by D.A. Blodgett to consider adoption as an option for her son. When she started saying, hey, something's wrong with my son, they're like, well, maybe you should consider getting him adopted. And they connected her to Bethany Christian Services. She said that she would get in trouble with the Bethany Christian Services social workers when she would comment on her son's health when she visited him. On one visit, she told me that he had a sinus infection and his nose was bleeding, blood was coming out of it, and she asked if she could take him to the doctor to help him. She's like, why are you guys not doing anything? Something's wrong here. And they accused her of being unstable. Imagine that. So she also says that a social worker with Bethany Christian Services told her that women like her make bad choices, so that adoption was the best choice for her son. Again, pretty crazy, pretty messed up. So it goes on from there. Eventually, she does sign over her parental rights, and they take her child. But what I thought was just really crazy, this is one part I want to tell you guys about. She was told that as soon as she delivered her son, he would be taken. And after surrendering her parental rights, she fled to Ohio. She was now pregnant with her second son and was told by a social worker that Michigan CPS practices relating to her son's adoption were criminal. So even just shortly after this happened, a Charity talked to her gynecologist, and she said, what, like she described the whole situation, and they started telling her what just happened to you was illegal. That was criminal. That there's no way that them taking your kid that quickly, and what Charity described as D.A. Blodgett and Bethany Christian Services funneling children between their organizations. After a month after the adoption, Charity contacted Bethany Christian Services to get a mailing address for her son. She was told that they could not give her the address and that they could not deliver letters or pictures for her. She was told that that the family had asked for no mail at the time. So she waits 1 more month. And again, you have to remember, she was told this was going to be an open adoption, letters, and all this kind of stuff. So she waits 1 more month, and she receives the same response. She told me, quote, felt like I was in a twilight zone. I still feel like I'm in a twilight zone talking about it. I did the thing they told me to do, and now I want to interact with my son. I wanted my son to be able to have those things, the letters and pictures. In the years since the adoption, she has had no contact with Bethany or the adoptive parents of her son. But as I mentioned earlier, 3 years ago, she started meeting other mothers on TikTok who have had similar experiences. She now runs her own TikTok account called the Bitter Birth Mom Club, where she shares her story and offers support for other mothers. She told me some of our stories are very different, but Bethany, at the end of the day, is the one that gained financially from what happened to all of us, and they're never going to come to account for this. Bethany is never going to be held accountable for making us strangers to our children, and it's so disgusting because they really think us, the birth parents, are not important to children. And she says here, I want people to understand that domestic violence is not something that should be held against a safe and stable parent in these situations. We deserve safety. We deserve better laws. Children shouldn't be removed from families because of domestic violence unless it's unsafe. And what she's talking about is that Bethany used the fact that she had been in a domestic violence situation against her to take her child, even though after the fact the baby was fine and safe, the husband was gone, and she created a home and a space for the baby, but they use it against her. Now let's talk about Jennifer. This will be the last one, and again, I encourage you guys to go read the article, The Last American Vagabond, and to learn more about this stuff. I really, really do implore you to learn more about this. I will continue to report on it as much as I can. I know that this is not unusual for some of you guys. For some of you, it might be very new, but the point is, this is all happening in the background, along with all the other corruption that's happening. You got the adoption industry, the foster industry, the CPS, the human trafficking. There's definitely connections between these things. I'm not accusing Bethany Christian Services of human trafficking. I'm saying there is absolutely a connection between these type of things and the fact that in these situations, children often end up being abused physically, emotionally, sexually, etc. And if we really care about the kids, I think we need to do a better job of trying to figure out how to help them. Jennifer was only 18 when she became pregnant while attending a conservative college in 1990. Uncertain of what to do, she confided in the dean of her school. And while pregnant students were typically expelled, she was told that if she participated in counseling, she could continue being a student. She was offered various pamphlets from different organizations, one of which was Bethany Christian Services. When she told her conservative Christian parents about this, they showed her anger and shame, and she was told that if she didn't give up the baby for adoption, she would not get support from them, and she would be totally cut off from them for financial support. Eventually, she would speak to a female counselor from Bethany to learn about her options. And at the time, open adoptions were relatively new. And Jennifer she told me she's the one who brought up the idea after learning about it. And from there, she says the Bethany Christian Services counselor steered her towards the idea. Looking back, Jennifer believes she was subject to subtle programming by the counselor who told her that she was incapable of raising the child on her own, also showing her pictures of potential adoptive parents. So they start showing you, like, look, these people can take your baby. These people can take your baby. And maybe just getting in a mother's mind who's already dealing with all this trauma, like, okay, I don't really want to do this, but look, they got a family waiting. Maybe this is the best option. And then, of course, the programming saying it's not like you don't have the resources. You look at you, you're too young. Your family's not going to help. They do whatever they can to discourage you. And again, Bethany Christian Services is a Christian organization that discourages abortion and promotes adoption. That's a whole deeper element of that. And I interviewed author Catherine Joyce. You can find that at theconsciousresistance.com last week, talking more about her work on the broader adoption industry and the Christian angle. By early 1991, Jennifer says the potential adoptive mother became very involved in the process. And this seems to be a pattern. The adoptive parents get super stoked and really involved, and to the point of stressing out the parents. She said she continued to feel pressured, overwhelmed, but also numb. Jennifer would end up having her pregnancy induced through drugs because her pregnancy had gone past the calculated due date. And while she said she requested that the adoptive parents not be present for the birth, she was ignored, and the adoptive mother was in the operating room during the birth. She said the adoptive mother got to see her baby before she did. As a result of the drugs, Jennifer was forced to undergo an emergency C-section. And Jennifer's parents came to the hospital. They saw the baby. They apologized, but they still said they can't help. The father of Jennifer's child, now her husband, they were also working to try to come up with some solution to keep the baby. 3 days after the birth, the Bethany Christian Services counselor tells Jennifer, it's time to hand over your baby. Jennifer's husband said that he was cornered by the counselor and pressured to sign a termination of his parental rights. And after that, they came to her saying, come on, your boyfriend already did it. All you got to do is just sign it. Go ahead and do it. And Jennifer said that she knows now that she should have been asked to sign paperwork before handing over her son. However, 2 days after Bethany took her son, the counselor came to Jennifer's house to get her to sign. She says that she was still under the influence of the painkillers from the C-section, and that when she expressed doubt about the adoption, again, the counselor used the threat of Child Protective Services to, quote, paint me in a corner. Jennifer said, quote, I was told that if I tried to get him back, you're going to have to get a lawyer and he's going to go into foster care. She was told that since her boyfriend had signed the paperwork, she was required to sign. Quote, I wasn't given proper information, told about the right to change my mind or what exactly the process was. And after the adoption took place, this is another really messed up part. So the adoption take place, they say that they're going to do the letters. Well, in her case, they actually did let her write letters to her child, even though they're a baby. The idea is that when they get older, they can read these letters. And in one of her letter, she said that, she expressed that she was not doing well, that she was depressed and she wasn't feeling good. And she felt that they had stolen her baby from her. And then the adoptive parents told this to Bethany Christian Services, and they told her, you can't say that. You can't be writing these things. And they told her something like, you can't write your true feelings. And after 6 months passed, she said she only heard from the adoptive parents once or twice a year with letters and photos. She kept in touch with the counselor for a time, but had few interactions with the adoptive couple. She saw them a few times over the years, but they would eventually sever all communication when the child was 13 years old. And she's tried to maintain relationships with her child, but she says it's been a roller coaster of emotions. And these days, Jennifer says she wants more people to understand the truth of adoptions and how it impacts the birth mothers. She says birth mothers live their lives with grief, second guessing every decision they make, and living in fear of having their children taken away from them. Quote, we're told specifically, move on with our lives and pretend it's not happening. I'm tired of that. I'm tired of not having a voice. There are so many of us, and we're coming out of the woodwork. It is my immense honor to be able to tell this story for these mothers. I know that some of you might not really understand the gravity of this situation, but for me, it feels great to be able to step in and help how I can. Not great that this is happening, obviously, but this is what journalism is about. This is why I do this work, so that when somebody in my audience, as this case, reaches out and says, hey, Derrick, there's a story and nobody's talking about it. Can you please help me out? I can dive in, I can do the work, I can get on the phone and make phone calls and do the research and find, is there a story? And if there is a story, what's my role that I can do to bring it to a wider audience? We're streaming across 10 different platforms right now. This is going to go out all over my channels and hopefully reach more people, and it's going to get shared by other channels. That's the goal. How do we spread information? How do we get to the right people so that, again, potential adoptive parents, mothers who have children in tough situations and aren't sure if they want to pursue adoption or what, so your full resources, so the full situation, so you are informed and educated, because you can't make a proper decision if you're not educated about what's really going on. And this is just the beginning. I will be doing more articles. As I said, there's going to be at least one more focused on the international scene related to the adoption, and then talking about solutions. And also, I will be talking about this situation, Justice for Katera. I encourage you to look that up, as our brother here is encouraging you to do. Search Justice for Katera. That'll be part of the next story that I'm going to do. Yeah, guys, please share that article. It's at thelastamericanvagabond.com. It doesn't give me any pleasure or joy to write about these things, other than, as I just said, to try to help people. But I understand it's messed up. I understand it's not fun to hear about these situations, and it's not all black and white. Some people would say, well, they should have been more responsible. They shouldn't have been having sex at a young age. They should, there's all kinds of excuses you can make. But at the end of the day, once again, it seems like this is a theme on tonight's show. If you care about the children, like a lot of people like to pretend, and then you should care about what's happening in Palestine. You should care about what's happening with Bethany Christian Services, and you should want these mothers to be properly informed, because the data shows that children are better off being raised by their own parents, by their own families, when possible. I'm not saying that's always possible. That's always the best decision or anything. I'm not blaming anybody who chooses adoption. I'm just saying, when there's that option, we should do what we can to support that option. Sometimes, as I've learned through my research, sometimes these mothers are literally just maybe a few $100s away from being able to keep their child. Like some of the mothers that Catherine Joyce's research was showing, was that if somebody had loaned them $500 or $1,000, they would have been able to, make a couple ends meet, and then been able to get a new apartment so that they could have welcomed their baby in, right? Think about that. How many parents out there who keep their babies struggle and live check to check sometimes. Sometimes times are hard. You like, for those who've lived in middle and lower class, you know what I'm talking about, that sometimes, you go without for a little bit, but you have your parents' love, you have the security and the safety of a home. And that's something that's beautiful. And maybe a foster home, an adoptive home can do that for children sometimes. But if you have the option to do that for a mother, for the children, for the family to stay together, that is a better opportunity. I'm not saying I know what the perfect solution is, but I think it is pretty fucked up that, to hear a mother say, if I had only had just a little bit more resources, I would have been able to take care of my baby and I wouldn't have had to give him up. And then none of this would have ever happened. Right. It's sad to hear. And a lot of these programs aren't necessarily available to everybody. And we don't even have to get into like welfare and that whole debate and discussion. I'm just saying it sucks when lives are entirely turned upside down and maybe in some cases ruined because of, just coming up short on some bills.
Since 2012, the Conscious Resistance Network has been an independent media organization focused on empowering individuals through education, philosophy, health, and community organizing. We work to create a world where corporate and state power do not rule over the lives of free human beings. Our motto is leading by example and helping others in their pursuit of freedom. Visit theconsciousresistance.com to find our articles, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, books, and more. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.